Joe Biden has abandoned the idea of no first use of nuclear weapons, which really enables the United States now, under present doctrine, to launch a nuclear surprise attack on nations that fall out of favor with us. There is this element of madmen, some of them politicians, some of them military people, many of them in the U.S. State Department, the Central Intelligence Agency, who would be willing to do the most reckless and insane of actions to risk nuclear weapons or nuclear war, or even to initiate it.
Senator Black, it is an honor to finally be speaking with you after being very aware of your excellent advocacy against the war on Syria and now against the global war, effectively against Russia and Russian-speaking people wherever they are, including in the Donbass. So I've long appreciated your work, and it's an honor to speak with you today.
Well, Eva, it's an honor for me also, because I have followed your very courageous work both in Syria and in Ukraine. You're certainly just one of the heroes of the movement of people who, you know, it's a rather small group of us, but we're very interested in doing what is right and just in international affairs, and that's kind of rare. But thank you for being very active in Ukraine and shedding the light of truth on what's going on.
Well, thank you. And again, just to applaud you, because you took a very strong position on Syria when it was not popular to do so. Most people towed the line on the Western narrative, the NATO narrative on Syria, but you didn't. And so I really applaud you for that, because many people, whether they're in politics or journalism, were afraid to take such a stance for fear of, career or loss of audience or what have you. So I really think it's commendable that you took that stance. Now, moving on to your position on, I'm really interested to hear what you have to say about Ukraine, the Donbass, Russia's special military operation. And just for followers, I'm sure everybody knows who you are, but in brief, you have a long career. You have a varied career in the military, in the Marines, I believe it was. Also, you have a legal background, a law degree, and you're practicing law firm. And you served in, I'm going to have to look at my notes to remember the term so I don't get that wrong. You served as a U.S. Army Judge Advocate General Corps, and then in Virginia State Senate. So you have a very interesting background, and you're very well equipped to talk about what we're going to discuss today regarding matters Ukraine, Russia, the war on the Donbass, and Russia's special military operation. I was listening to one of your recent interviews, and you were speaking, this is perhaps one of the most pressing issues of our time right now. You're speaking about the Biden administration's reversal on their policy regarding nuclear weapons. So can you please tell us what that is and what does it mean?
The Russian Federation has a policy of no first use of nuclear weapons. A very sane, very sensible policy. The United States, under Joe Biden has abandoned the idea of no first use of nuclear weapons, which really enables the United States now, under present doctrine, to launch a nuclear surprise attack on nations that fall out of favor with us, and essentially to carry out a nuclear Pearl Harbor, where we would have the ability to rain down hydrogen bombs on St. Petersburg and Moscow, and just obliterating pedestrians and motorists using the streets. There was actually a Republican senior senator on the Armed Services Committee who said, well, we're not going to take off the table the idea of a first nuclear strike on Russia. And the problem is that it wasn't a question of not taking it off the table. He had put it on the table by even raising the issue, the possibility of doing something like that. There is this element of madmen, some of them politicians, some of them military people, many of them in the U.S. State Department, the Central Intelligence Agency, who would be willing to do the most reckless and insane of actions to risk nuclear weapons or nuclear war, or even to initiate it. Earlier in the year, we saw where Ukraine was working a false flag attack, which you and I are both most familiar with. We've seen them over and over in Syria. There was one that we managed to stop in Idlib province later in the war, and that was thanks to intelligence that came out of Russia. But in any event, Ukraine actually tried to foster this idea of a dirty bomb attack by Russia. Clearly, when they started talking about it, they were the ones planning it. The Russians had no intention of doing anything of that sort. But I think because we were able to highlight it, the one disinfectant for a false flag attack is to preemptively announce that it is about to be carried out. And so they did that. They tried it with the dirty bomb. We preempted it. They weren't able to carry that out. But you watch. One of the favorites is this idea of a sarin gas attack. This is something that British MI6 has used over time. They worked it very effectively in Syria. There's not the slightest hint that Syria ever used poison gas. And at one time, the Secretary of Defense actually acknowledged that. And but anyway, we've always got to be watchful for these false flag attacks. And at the same time, there's an element, and it's not a dominant element, fortunately, but within the foreign policy and deep state establishment, there is an element that is prepared to risk a nuclear war, engage in one if necessary, and the idea that somehow we would come out on top. We wouldn't come out on top because they try to put out of their minds the Russian second strike capability. And I have no doubt that we would be able to knock out a great deal of Russian nuclear strike capability. But Russia has close to 6,000 nuclear warheads. About 1,500 are sort of in an immediate standby mode at any given time. That's a lot of nuclear weapons. It's far more, you go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States had a good number of missiles. Russia had, or the Soviet Union at the time, had a very small nuclear arsenal. Today, it's much different. And you can just a few Russian nuclear submarines that would survive no matter what we do would be able to rain down tremendous nuclear attack on the United States and on all of the NATO countries in Europe. And so the idea that somehow we would escape and we'd be able to beat up on Russia, I think it's very unrealistic.
And under what premise are whatever powers that be in the U.S. Pushing this nuclear strike idea? Under what premise are they pushing it? What sin has Russia committed?
If you look at the uproar that they caused in the media about the fact that in the 7th year of the war, after Ukraine had been attacking the Donbass for seven or more years, Russia finally entered the war on the side of Donbass, and the outrage was over the fact that Russia had crossed a sovereign national border. Well, you and I know from great experience in Syria, this idea that somehow it's unforgivable to cross a sovereign nation's border. The United States is unlawfully occupying northern Syria today. We have bases all over the place, and there's not the slightest hint of international law that would make that a lawful invasion. It was simply a war of aggression, and the purpose of it was to steal the wheat and the oil from Syria in order to impose a great famine on the country, which they have done. And so we've crossed borders in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Yemen. We cross borders all the time. There's hardly a year we don't cross borders. And yet, when Russia did it in order to defend the Russian-speaking people in the Donbass area and in Crimea, suddenly it became outrageous. The duplicity of the State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency and the White House is just breathtaking, because they created this national hysteria over something that we do on a routine basis, which is to cross national borders. Now, the only thing the independent people of the Donbass, I mean, they had declared their independence just as the colonies in the United States declared their independence from Great Britain. And that's how the United States began, was with a revolution against tyranny. The Lugansk and Donetsk declared the independence of their republics after they were subjected to tyrannical measures by the revolutionary junta that took power in Kiev in 2014, thanks to Central Intelligence Agency, British MI6, which turned protests into a violent revolution, which then began, killing, just slaughtering Russian-speaking Ukrainians. They went into the Donbass. There were very notorious instances in the Donbass where the revolutionaries in the 2014 revolution rose up and they cornered Russian-speaking people in buildings and then burned them down.
Yeah.
There's one fellow who managed to jump out of a burning building. He broke his leg, and then the mob of Ukrainian nationalists surrounded him, beat him to death. After they tried to burn him, they couldn't burn him. He broke his leg, then they beat him to death. Well, this kind of thing, Russia, the people who are in the Donbass are Russians. They're not Ukrainians. it was simply that after the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin moved the Donbass. He moved the line, and he didn't move the people of the Donbass into the country of Ukraine, because there was no country of Ukraine. He moved it into that part of the Soviet Union that was the Ukraine, and so it was an administrative line drawing back then. But in any event, the war that Ukraine has waged against the Donbass is wholly unjust.
Yeah.
There is no justification for it. And Americans are told, well, this whole thing started on February 24th of this year. It didn't. It started when President Obama made the decision to overthrow the government, the legitimate, duly elected government of Ukraine, and carried out a coup in 2014. And then, under the umbrella of the Minsk peace accords, which everybody was hoping would bring peace, we began flooding all of these weapons. We call them defensive weapons. I don't know, anything that can kill you is not defensive. It is an offensive weapon. And we flooded offensive weapons, very advanced weapons, and we built up a very powerful Ukrainian army with the express purpose, with the determination of attacking Russia. The purpose was not to sort out some goings on within Ukraine, which Ukraine didn't mean anything to the United States. We didn't care anything about it. But there were elements in NATO and within the globalist movement, the deep state, and the foreign policy establishment, all of them casting a greedy eye on Russia with its immense natural resources, and with the idea that we could do a repeat, perhaps, of what happened with the breakup of the Soviet Union, when you had a handful of oligarchs, folks who had some money, and they were able to buy up the lands of Russia and the old Soviet Union and get them on pennies on the dollar. Now you have a new generation of people who look at Russia and say, the natural wealth of Russia is colossal. It is just beyond anything that's imaginable, and so we would like to be able to overthrow Russia, and we would like to be able to pick up their resources, have the boys from Davos move in and buy up what they want, get it cheaply, and become trillionaires and mega billionaires. Understandably, the Russian people don't want to accept that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that excellent response. I want to just touch on some things you've said. Having spent quite a bit of time in the Donbass this year, and also one visit in 2019, absolutely the people there do consider themselves ethnic Russians. And people that I've spoken to, they said in the beginning, just as you outlined, it wasn't necessarily that they wanted to be independent. They just wanted to keep very much at arm's length the massacres and the Nazism, the fascism that was occurring in Odessa and Kiev. They wanted to retain their history. They didn't want to be slaughtered for being ethnic Russians. And I was there in September during the referendum. People made it very clear that they wanted to join Russia, and they had wanted it since 2014. In spite of what the West said about sham elections, we all know that the West, as you were saying, they cross lines when they want to because they're hypocrites and are excellent at double standards. Law means nothing to them when they want to overthrow a government for their own nefarious purposes. But in terms of, what you're saying too about most people don't know that prior to February 2022, 8 years prior to it, Ukraine has been warring on the Donbass. I knew when I wrote an article in April, I looked at official statistics from the DPR and the LPR, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And at that time, end of March, around 8,000 civilians, just civilians, not defenders, not soldiers, but civilians alone had been killed. Now, in a press conference held just on Wednesday, referring to the Joint Center for Control and Coordination, they gave the shocking statistic that since the special military operation began and since so mid-February, Ukrainian shelling have killed 4,500 civilians and injured over 4,000. And that's just this year. That's a huge increase. And of course, we'll never hear about that in the media. And having been going to the Donbass frequently this year, pretty much every month this year, I spend 3 weeks, and I come back here, I spend 3 or 4 weeks, and I go back, etc. Every time I've been there, there's been intense shelling of the city, not just of Donetsk, but also Gorlivka, Makivka, other cities. But if we're speaking only of the capital city, Donetsk, the very heart of the city has been shelled by weapons, including NATO weapons. And I know you can elaborate more on this than I can, but they're being sent to residential areas and pedestrian areas and parks and markets. Every month that I've been there, there's been devastating scenes of civilians' bodies strewn throughout the streets, body parts throughout the streets. In June, Ukrainian shelling targeted a maternity hospital. In late July, Ukraine fired rockets containing petal mines, each rocket containing over 300 petal mines. These mines are still maiming civilians. Nearly 90 civilians have been maimed by them, including I met a 14-year-old boy in November whose foot was blown off by one of these mines when he was going to visit his grandmother. In August, Ukrainian shelling targeted the very center of the city and shelled right outside the hotel I was in, killing a woman, and shelling in that area killed 6 people that day, including an 11-year-old ballerina. Again, horrific scenes of their bodies torn apart. In September, in the space of 5 days, Ukrainian shelling of the center of the city killed 26 civilians. And I saw the different areas where the shelling occurred, and again, saw the bodies in the streets, horrific scenes, And I guess my lead up with all this information is, you're aware of it, I'm aware of it, but the way the media is portraying it is A, to completely whitewash these crimes. B, if they ever even mention scenes from Donetsk, they take them and then they depict them as being in Ukraine under Russian shelling. And then otherwise, as we well know, I know I've seen you've done interviews on the Bucha massacre, which was committed by Ukrainian forces, to completely vilify Russia. So my question to you, Senator Black, is, in your opinion, or rather, how would you describe Russia's military operation with regard to, say, comparing how the US operates, how Ukraine operates, et cetera, how Saudi Arabia operates in terms of wanton slaughter of civilians, and Russia's tactics in its military operation in Ukraine? Has it been employing the same sort of tactics of mass, like Raqqa, for example, the mass destruction of Raqqa and all the, we don't know, thousands, perhaps, civilians killed? Are these similar warfare tactics, or is there a difference?
From what I know, that the Russian forces have followed the laws of war. I know that from the command level, there is no support for anyone who commits violations of the laws of war. Now, I can't tell you that there aren't things that happen out in the field. Nobody can do that. But you mentioned Bucha, and I found that very interesting because, I was a career prosecutor. I was the head of the criminal law division in the Pentagon, responsible for criminal prosecutions within the Army worldwide. And I got there because I was known as a very, very stern prosecutor at major military installations. And so I sort of have a way of looking at crime scenes in a very rational way. So I saw the videos that were sent out of Bucha, and immediately they were different. Now, you and I have seen massive slaughters in Syria by Al Qaeda and its affiliates, ISIS, all of these other names that they come up with. They're all under the umbrella of Al Qaeda. And when you see a slaughter, a mass slaughter, it is generally you have people who are brought together in a place. That's where they're beheaded, or that's where they're gunned down, or whatever. This was interesting because in Bucha, first of all, the bodies didn't start appearing until 4 days after the Russians left. The mayor of the city proclaimed, glory, hallelujah, the Russians have been driven out. There was not a mention of any slaughter, anything of that sort. Then all of a sudden, 4 days after the Ukrainian psychological operations troops entered the city, dead people started appearing on the streets. And they showed videos of, out the window where they're driving along, and here would be a dead person. Over there would be a dead person. 100 feet further, there was a dead person. All of them right on the side of the street with their hands zip tied behind them, just the same way that the Ukrainian soldiers zip tie all of their prisoners. And it was interesting because you look at the armbands that were worn by these civilians who were laying dead there. Now, the custom at the time, if someone was a Ukrainian sympathizer, they would wear a blue armband. If they were either a Russian sympathizer or simply just totally neutral, they'd wear a white armband. All of the armbands were white. None of them were blue. Why weren't Ukrainian sympathizers killed? Why only Russian sympathizers? Why would the Russians choose to kill Russian sympathizers as they're leaving town? Now, the Russians had occupied Bucha for over a month. I don't know how long it was. And if they had decided they were going to execute some people, why not round them up, take them out in the woods, slaughter them, bury them, and get rid of the evidence? Mm-hmm. That's the way. You and I have seen these things. Yeah. We've seen these things happen in Syria. And I've watched similar things over a lifetime. But that was what happened. Now, if the Russians were going to do that, now why would they wait until they're leaving town to gun people down? And why would they choose to lay them down like monuments along the road, mm-hmm. As clear evidence that they had done it? The whole thing was such a total transparent fraud that it was just amazing that mainstream, the corporate media, journalists totally overlooked it and assumed that, oh, well, this must have been Russians because the Ukrainians told us it was Russians who did it. Yeah. So it was fraudulent. My guess is that what happened is that after the Ukrainian army moved in, they identified those people who had worked together with the Russians, or perhaps given them food, water, whatever, and they took them out and they executed them, which they're very famous for doing.
Yeah.
And then they blamed it on the other side, and the Western media just simply became a megaphone, amplifying the lies that they were publishing.
Yes, it's it's the same line of illogical line of thinking. Whenever a Western media would say the Syrian government, the Syrian army gassed its own people, it always occurred at a time when the army was winning by conventional means. And when, if the government had actually done that, it would have done so knowing it would bring the wrath of the West upon them. Obama's famous red line anniversary. And it was just completely illogical, just as you've outlined. All the claims around this area are completely illogical. And it's really, I would say, I'd like to think the Western public would be insulted. I have no way of gauging how much the West are actually believing these lies anymore. That kind of brings me to my next question. How much would you say people are believing all this Russia-phobic claims, soldiers raping babies, all this stuff? And is the American public, in your opinion, growing weary of this war?
The initial zeal that people felt about, let's go to war, it's actually very easy to generate a war spirit among people if you spread propaganda.
Yeah.
The zeal has dissipated, and if you held an election, if you held a poll and you said, well, how many support Ukraine, how many support Russia, you get a high number who support Ukraine. But the fact of the matter is, people are disinterested. If you say, well, do you support Ukraine or Russia? Somebody would say Ukraine. If you said, well, did you know that the price of toothpaste has doubled? Well, all of a sudden they say, what? The price of toothpaste has doubled? Since when? Well, it happened 2 weeks ago. In other words, yeah, okay, I'm on the side of Ukraine, but when it's something that really affects me, like the price of toothpaste, I'm really on it. That's a big deal. That's gonna mobilize me to action to try to bring down the price of toothpaste. What I'm saying is that Ukraine is so distant. Even today, I suspect there are a good number of people who don't know what continent Ukraine is on.
Absolutely.
They don't know where it fits. They don't know anything about it. So you end up with this stratified foreign policy elite. And I'm not talking about people who are high and mighty, but I'm talking about people who are intellectually able to address issues. It's on our side, it's a small elite. You are part of it. I'm part of it. We know a number of people who are. We understand foreign policy and military policy. On the other side, there is a much larger elite, but proportionately, it's small relative to the population of the country. I've communicated with Congress, with every single member of Congress on various foreign issues. And what I find is that for the most part, they don't have a clue. I mean, they don't know anything about the country, the history. They don't know why we're involved. They just know nothing. They just, whatever the leadership tells them, they say, okay, well, let's do that. Tulsi Gabbard got my attention when I sent one letter out, and I got all these ridiculous responses from congressmen, and all of a sudden hers came in, and I was writing about Syria at the time, and she knew precisely what was happening in Syria. And I looked and I said, who is this person? And I said, my gosh, it's a woman congressman from Hawaii and Hawaii is in outer space. I said, how in the world does she come to understand Syria? And I was so impressed. It's the only time in my life I've ever done this. I wrote a second letter solely to tell her how impressed I was with her knowledge of what was going on. But anyway, I will tell you that there is more talk now among the American people about peace, that it's kind of time to move on, to stop hearing all this stuff about Ukraine. Let's have them make peace. And of course, the decision of peace and war is up to the United States. Mm-hmm. It's not up to NATO. We are NATO. We command NATO. We tell the EU what to do and when to do it. And ever since Second World War, Europe has sort of become this group of chattel states, or that they simply do what they're told, and it's a shame. It's a shame they don't have independence, but it's a fact. And so I think that there is growing disinterest in the war in the United States, and there is growing interest in peace talks. That Europe, I think, is even more so. I think there's beginning to be antagonism towards the war and a great interest in peace talks. I think they're ahead of the United States in that regard.
So given, I'm sure you're aware that yesterday around 7 a.m., Ukraine fired 40 Grad via multi-launch rocket systems, 40 Grads at Donetsk almost simultaneously. And given what we know about the 4,500 civilians killed since February this year, and that Russia is not going to, Russia has been comparatively light-handed in terms of decimating these Ukrainian forces that are firing on Donetsk and other cities. But ultimately, I know I've seen military analysts comment that, now that winter has set in, some would say that it's going to be a slow grind, basically letting the Ukrainian army, unfortunately, I don't want to see anyone die, but, they are being sent to their deaths, ill-equipped and against a much stronger force. So I think some are surmising that it's going to be a slow grind, just grinding the Ukrainian army down. Others are saying also there could be a Russian offensive to take out these positions near Donetsk that are firing on the city. In either case, do you have any kind of, I hate to ask this because I don't like to answer that kind of question. I can't possibly know what's going to happen in the future, but do you have any sense of how things might play out in the near and longer future, how this will end?
I'm very, very focused right now on what is happening in the front lines along the Donbass. Right now, of course, the focus is on Bakhmut, which has just become a slaughterhouse for Ukrainian soldiers. The Russians have kind of figured out a strategy that is working there, and there's no doubt the Russians are losing troops, but at just a small fraction of the losses of Ukraine. Ukraine keeps flooding in troops. They sent in 20,000 not too long ago, and those are just chewed up almost as soon as they get there. There's an American, a retired Marine colonel who's in charge of something called the Mozart Group, which trains the Ukrainians for battle. And he said the stories that you hear about 70% losses in most of the units in that area are true. He said those are not exaggerations. And now this is a guy who's working for Ukraine, who's trying to win the war for them. But he says, yes, the losses are tremendous. And he said now that replacements are being sent in to battle who have never fired a rifle.
Yeah.
They're just people sent there to be slaughtered, and they are being killed in many cases almost as soon as they arrive. Now, what I've seen over the last 10 days or so, let me back up. We saw this fall offensive by Ukraine, which they considered a great success, where they managed to drive the Russians back from Kharkiv, a significant expanse of territory. But Kharkiv was very thinly defended. These were not the most combat ready forces, and it was just a skeleton crew. And Russia told them, they didn't tell them to hold the line at any cost. They told them just move back, come back to defensive positions, which they did. And so the Ukrainians lost a lot of men from artillery as they were moving forward. The Russians did not. Even though they gave up a lot of land, they did not lose a lot of lives. Down in Kherson, where the Ukrainians had launched major attacks, the Russian lines held. The Russian lines did not break, they did not fold. But when the new theater commander, General Servokin, when he took over, he said, the Russian forces were able to advance across the Dnieper River, and they were expanding greatly. But right now they're not moving, they're just defensive, and they're in a very perilous position where knocking out a single pontoon bridge would cut off their supply lines. He says, this is not rational. We're going to move out. Under his direction, the Russians executed one of the most professionally conducted retrograde movements ever. Now, a lot of the people the armchair commentators who simply, play war games, the pro-Russian people were saying, oh, well, what's he doing? He's given up this land. Well, to me, that was a major accomplishment by the Russian army to withdraw without any casualties, to move all of their equipment out, to manage to evacuate all the civilian population, the Russian-speaking population, out of Kherson, and to then establish clear defensible lines. Now, so where Russia ended up after that fall offensive, they began building multiple lines of defense from very defensible positions. And even General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, made an announcement. He said, look, basically, the Ukrainians have taken all the low-hanging fruit, and they're not going to be able to get any further. The Russians are too strongly dug in, and it's time to talk peace, because the Ukrainians aren't going to get any further than they've already gone. That's really what he was saying. And I agree with that. Even the Washington Post, about 1 month ago, they had really an excellent article assessing the current status of the war. And they talked about these multiple lines of defense that had been formed around the Donbass area, and how incredibly difficult it had become for the Ukrainians to try to advance any further. Now, so that was happening. Now, meanwhile, it's important for people to understand that Russia went into this war. They didn't want to go in. This was not some grand plan. President Putin was forced into kind of a last minute decision to go in. Russia had desperately worked to avoid war. They had put proposals on the table with NATO, and meanwhile, Ukraine, with the help of NATO, was preparing a massive assault on the Donbass. They were going to slaughter Russian people in the Donbass, and President Putin said, "Okay, we've got to do something to stop it," and he launched his attack in order to break up the momentum and the drive towards attacking the Donbass, and he was successful in that. But Russia went in with a very small force of men. They didn't have nearly the 3-to-1 advantage that an attacker has to have under standard military doctrine. This is widely known, common military doctrine. The attacker has a 3-to-1 advantage. Well, I'm not sure that Russia even had a 1-to-1 ratio. It was very understaffed. Now, to return to today, Russia ordered mobilization. It's the first time they have ordered mobilization. The mobilization went very smoothly, despite all the stuff you hear about it. There were Russians who left to avoid the draft. Same thing happened to the United States during the Vietnam War. A lot of people went to Canada to avoid the draft. Massive numbers of Ukrainians fled the country to avoid the draft. I mean, a major proportion of the entire population of Ukraine. So to get all worked up about the fact that some Russians have evaded the draft really detracts from the fact that the mobilization was extremely successful. There were many people who simply volunteered to join. What has happened is Russia has doubled its strength on the front lines around the Donbass, particularly. So they're no longer, defending against much greater forces. Now they're a pretty robust force on the front line. By the early winter, that force, that now robust force, is going to double again. So from the mobilization, we will have seen the Russian forces on the front line quadruple. At the same time, Ukraine continues to wither because Zelensky sees himself as some sort of a military wizard because they gave him a green T-shirt and they turned him from a TV comedian into a military hero by virtue of a green T-shirt. And he thinks he knows it all. And he thinks, okay, if you just keep throwing people at something, then eventually you're going to prevail. Well, he's not going to prevail this time because Russia now has an adequate force. Their supplies are coming in very smoothly. Meanwhile, this drone attack, the Ukrainians have not figured out how to defend against the drone attack. The Patriot missile systems, that's not going to do it. Because each Patriot missile costs $3 million. Each drone costs $30,000. The Iranian drones that were shipped to Russia have proven to create a dilemma for NATO, because if you can knock out a $3 million product with a $30,000 product, you get a big problem. I mean, the people firing Patriot missiles yeah, the defense contractors are going to make a bundle of money, but it's not going to work for Ukraine. So we are now in a position where it appears to me that Bakhmut is perhaps close to falling. The forces, the Russian forces have actually occupied some of the streets of Bakhmut. The defenses are gradually declining. It's beginning to look like Ukraine is running out of reinforcements to send in. And I think, unless I miss the mark, I think Bakhmut will fall. And unless Zelensky is willing to let them withdraw, we could end up seeing a substantial army trapped and captured and have to surrender in Bakhmut. Because I don't think that the Russians prefer to just fight from house to house. I think they would rather encircle Bakhmut, cut it off from all supplies, reinforcements, cut the water, cut the electricity, and just wait until they have to surrender. So we're reaching a point in the war where in the north, the ground is it's frozen solid to where tanks can move cross country. They can get off the roads where they can be much safer. That hasn't happened yet around the Donbass, but as time goes on, the frozen earth will work its way from the north to the south. And at this point, what I see happening is there are small advances all along the line, of the Donbass. It's where there are clashes. The Russians are moving forward a little here, moving forward a little there. I don't know whether it's a grand strategy or simply a reflection of the more robust Russian forces, that when something breaks out, the Russians are able to prevail and they're able to advance a little here, a little there. Often military actions work this way, where it's not a grand strategy that is figured out in advance. Now, often it is, but not always. Sometimes what happens is there's a breakthrough that's unexpected somewhere on the line, and bright, aggressive commanders exploit that, and the next thing you have something unfolding that the enemy can't deal with, particularly with all their reserves so depleted. So we don't know whether there's some planned movement by the Russians to advance in a very systematic way, or whether it's just something that's happening. Now, we know that Russia's made the decision to chew up the Ukrainian army in Bakhmut. Absolutely. However, even if Bakhmut stayed in Ukrainian hands, it would be a Pyrrhic victory for them. It would be a disaster for them. It is already a disaster. Whether the town actually changes hands is not relevant to that. However, I do think Russia will take Bakhmut. But as that's happening, we're seeing this edging forward all along the line. And I think that what I anticipate is that Russia will look and say, okay, we've paralyzed the electrical system of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. They don't have an effective defense. Over time, countries do develop effective defenses. and we've seen this happen different times during the war with the HIMARS system that the US sent in. It was very difficult to deal with at first. Now, somehow, magically, the Russians have figured out how to shoot down HIMARS missiles, and they've been pretty effective at it. So the same thing will happen. There's a chance that NATO and Ukraine will come up with a solution to this drone problem. So I think the time may be right for Russia to act. I don't know what that time will be, whether it will be, within the next week or two, whether it'll be within the next month or two. I suspect it will be during the winter, while the foliage is off of the trees, making it much more difficult for NATO to launch long-range attacks at the Russians. I say NATO, but through their proxies, and in some cases, I think we believe that the HIMARS systems are operated probably by Blackwater type mercenaries working for the U.S. government, but experienced military personnel. So I think the time is right for a Russian advance. I think the Russian people are prepared to make the sacrifices necessary to win the war. And I think that right now, Ukraine, while the people still remain solidly in support of the war, there is a war weariness. Just recently, Ukraine announced that they were going to extend the mobilization. In other words, they're going to draft a lot of new people into the military. Well, they first started mobilizing on February the 19th, and Russia has just mobilized, and so they've extended the mobilization, and they've had wave after wave after wave of drafts and so forth. And this latest one, they said, well, we're going to have to extend it further. And Defense Minister Anna Malyar, the Deputy Defense Minister of Ukraine, when reporters responded to this latest move to close off draft exemptions, she warned them. She said, don't panic. We don't want you to panic. And she said, don't paint this as some scary apocalypse. In other words, she and the Ukrainian leadership are afraid that the Ukrainian people will see this new mobilization attempt as a sign that Russia is about to win the war. We've got to throw in elderly men, people who are partially crippled, people, who normally would never be considered, little young boys. This happened to Germany at the very end, the closing days of the war. They sent the Hitler Youth, the young teenage boys, 13, 14-year-old boys, to fight hardened Soviet veterans. And this is happening in Ukraine now. So I think the time is now for Russia to move forward and to end the war. That's what I anticipate will happen.
Well, I think it sounds like it is the time. And I mean, again, this is also unnecessary. But as you outlined, it's not Russia who brought this on. Unfortunately, the Western corporate-owned media will continue with their circus clown reporting, or reporting in air quotes. But it's voices like yours, speaking out with knowledge from your own experience, with knowledge from your experience in Syria as well, and your military and legal knowledge. that's going to help make the change. Obviously, the real battle is on the ground, but I mean, in terms of the information war, it's really important, voices like yours speaking out. So with that, thank you so much for your time, Senator Black. I really appreciate that. I will wind it up because I think I've taken an hour of your time, and I know you're a busy man, but I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Eva, and thank you for all that you're doing.